The red sand of Kepler 789c stretched endlessly in all directions under the harsh twin suns. Heat waves danced across the barren landscape like invisible spirits, making the distant mountains shimmer and blur. This was not a place where any sane creature would choose to live, but it was perfect for testing survival skills. Every year for the past century, the most skilled builders from across the galaxy gathered here. They came to prove their worth in the 1-hour shelter challenge, ADB, competition that had become legendary among spacefaring civilizations. The rules were simple enough that even a child could understand them, but the execution required years of training and natural talent that few possessed. Ambassador Prism floated 3 feet above the ground, her crystalline body catching and reflecting the sunlight in brilliant patterns. As the representative of the luminary people, she had spent decades perfecting the art of crystal growth. Her species could manipulate light and energy to create structures that were both beautiful and incredibly strong. They had won the competition twice in the last 10 years, and Prism was confident they would win again. Across the staging area, Commander Thorne was doing push-ups with one arm while his 3 teammates stretched their massive muscles. The Vraxians stood nearly 8 feet tall and possessed 4 arms each, making them natural diggers and builders. Their underground bunker systems were famous throughout the galaxy for being nearly indestructible. They had held the current record for 3 straight years, with a time of 52 minutes and 14 seconds. Other competitors represented dozens of different species. The insect-like hive queen Buzz commanded a team of 6 workers who moved in perfect synchronization. The gaseous ethereals had somehow managed to participate by wearing special containment suits that allowed them to manipulate solid materials. Even the plant-based Verdani had sent a representative, though nobody was quite sure how they would build anything without hands. The judging panel consisted of 3 floating spherical machines, each one programmed with the knowledge of every building technique known to galactic civilization. They had sensors that could detect the smallest structural weakness and computers that could predict how well a shelter would hold up under extreme conditions. There was no way to cheat or fool them. Tom Bradley sat on a metal crate, quietly eating a sandwich he had packed for lunch. He looked completely out of place among the alien competitors. At average human height and build, he seemed small and weak compared to most of the others. His gray hair and weathered face suggested he was past his prime, and his simple work clothes looked shabby next to the elaborate ceremonial gear worn by other delegates. The other competitors had been studying Tom with curiosity since his arrival 3 days earlier. Humans were relatively new to the galactic community, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 50 years ago. Most species still considered them to be primitive upstarts who had gotten lucky with their technology. The fact that they had been invited to participate in such a prestigious competition had surprised many observers. Tom had spent his career building structures in some of the harshest environments imaginable. He had constructed research stations in Antarctica, where the temperature dropped to -80 degrees. He had supervised the building of mining facilities on asteroids where one small mistake meant being sucked into the vacuum of space. Most recently, he had overseen the construction of the first permanent human settlement on Europa, one of Jupiter's moons, where the ice was harder than steel, and the radiation could kill an unprotected person in minutes. The announcement system crackled to life, and a mechanical voice began explaining the challenge rules in 17 different languages. Each competitor would be given a designated area measuring 100 meters by 100 meters. Scattered throughout each area would be identical supplies: metal sheets, polymer tubes, adhesive compounds, basic tools, and various electronic components. The goal was to build a shelter that could protect a single person for 72 hours. The shelter had to meet specific requirements that were designed to test every aspect of survival engineering. It needed to withstand sandstorms with winds up to 200 kilometers per hour. The internal temperature had to remain between 20 and 25 degrees Celsius, even though outside temperatures would swing from -10 to +60 degrees. The structure also needed to provide clean air, safe drinking water, and basic waste disposal for 3 full days. Most challenging of all, the shelter had to be built using only the materials provided. No competitor was allowed to bring their own tools or supplies. Everyone would start with exactly the same resources, making success dependent purely on skill, knowledge, and creativity. The current record holder, Commander Thorn, had achieved his time by organizing his team like a military unit. Each Varaxian had a specific role to play, and they executed their bunker construction with machine-like precision. They dug deep underground where the temperature was more stable and the wind could not reach them. Their shelters were built to last for months, not just the required 3 days. Ambassador Prism's approach was completely different. She used her natural ability to grow crystals, creating structures that looked more like art than practical buildings. Her shelters were incredibly strong and beautiful, but they took time to grow properly. The Luminari method required patience and careful energy control, skills that could not be rushed. Tom finished his sandwich and stood up to stretch his legs. He had been watching the other competitors and studying the terrain for the past 3 days, but he had not shared his plans with anyone. When other delegates had tried to start conversations about building techniques, he had politely changed the subject. Some had interpreted his silence as nervousness or lack of confidence. The truth was that Tom had already decided on his approach. His years of experience had taught him that the best solutions were often the simplest ones. While other species relied on their natural advantages or advanced technologies, humans had learned to adapt and improvise. They had survived and thrived on Earth not because they were the strongest or fastest creatures, but because they could find creative solutions to difficult problems. The countdown timer appeared in the sky above the competition field, showing exactly 1 hour in bright red numbers. In just a few minutes, the challenge would begin, and Tom would have the chance to show the galaxy what human engineering could accomplish. He walked toward his designated area, ready to prove that sometimes the most powerful tool in the universe was a creative mind that refused to give up. The massive timer in the sky reached 0, and chaos erupted across the competition field. Competitors scattered in all directions like startled birds, each racing toward their designated building areas with desperate urgency. The sound of running, feet, mechanical whirring, and alien battle cries filled the air as the 1-hour shelter challenge officially began. Commander Thorn let out a thunderous roar that could be heard across the entire field. His 4 arms pumped like pistons as he charged toward his construction zone, followed closely by his 3 teammates. The Vraxians had practiced this opening sprint countless times, and they moved with the coordination of a professional dance troupe. Within seconds of reaching their area, they had formed a perfect square and begun their synchronized digging sequence. The ground trembled under their assault, as 8 massive arms struck the hard-packed sand in perfect rhythm. Sand flew in all directions as they carved out what would become their underground bunker system. Thorn called out commands in their native language, and his team adjusted their digging pattern without missing a beat. They had done this so many times that they could build their shelter while blindfolded. Ambassador Prism took a completely different approach to the opening moments. Instead of rushing toward her area, she floated calmly to the center and began a slow meditation ritual. Her crystalline body started to glow with soft blue light as she gathered energy from the twin suns overhead. The luminary method required careful preparation and could not be rushed, even with the pressure of the countdown timer looming over everything. Other competitors around the field were following their own species-specific strategies. Hive Queen. Buzz had split her team into 3 pairs, each pair responsible for gathering different types of materials. They moved with insect efficiency, never wasting a single motion as they sorted through the scattered supplies. The ethereals, in their Containment suits were already beginning to reshape metal sheets using their gaseous forms, creating flowing curves that no solid being could duplicate. The Verdani representative presented a fascinating sight as it slowly walked across its designated area. The plant-based creature was actually tasting the soil with its root-like feet, somehow analyzing the chemical composition and moisture content. Most observers had no idea what this information could possibly contribute to shelter construction, but the Verdani had surprised people before with their unconventional methods. Tom Bradley stood perfectly still in the center of his area for a full 90 seconds after the timer started. While every other competitor was already deep into their construction process, he simply turned in a slow circle, his experienced eyes cataloging every piece of available material and every feature of the landscape around him. The alien observers in the viewing stands began to murmur among themselves. Some wondered if the human had frozen up under pressure, while others speculated that he was following some mysterious Earth ritual. A few of the more knowledgeable spectators recognized that he was conducting a detailed survey, but none of them understood why he was taking so much time when every second counted. Tom's survey was incredibly thorough despite its apparent simplicity. He noted the direction of the prevailing wind based on how the sand had formed small dunes around obstacles. He observed the angle of the sunlight and calculated how it would change throughout the day and night cycle. He identified which materials were closest to his optimal building location and which ones he could safely ignore completely. Most importantly, he was looking for features that other competitors might overlook. A small depression in the ground that would provide natural wind protection, a rocky outcrop that could serve as one wall of his shelter, a drainage pattern that would channel water away from his foundation. These details were invisible to beings who relied on brute force or exotic technologies, but they were obvious to someone who had spent decades working with natural materials in harsh environments. When Tom finally began to move, his actions seemed almost random compared to the organized chaos around him. He walked directly to a pile of polymer sheets and began selecting specific pieces, examining each one carefully before either keeping it or tossing it aside. His selection criteria were not immediately obvious to observers, but every piece he chose had particular properties that would be useful for his intended design. The Vraxians had already excavated a hole 3 meters deep and were beginning to install support beams for their underground complex. Their construction site looked like a military engineering project, with materials organized in neat piles and every team member following a predetermined work schedule. They were making excellent progress toward their goal of beating their previous record time. Ambassador Prism had finished her meditation and begun the crystal growing process. Energy flowed from her body into the materials around her, causing metal sheets to develop crystalline structures that made them stronger and lighter than their original form. The process was beautiful to watch, but it required intense concentration and could not be hurried without risking structural failure. Tom was working with what appeared to be a completely different philosophy. Instead of trying to fight against the harsh environment, he seemed to be studying how to work with it. He bent metal sheets into curved shapes that would deflect wind rather than resist it. He positioned polymer tubes to take advantage of natural air currents for ventilation. Every decision he made seemed designed to use the environment's own forces to help his shelter rather than oppose them. The viewing stands were filled with representatives from dozens of alien civilizations, all watching the competition with intense interest. Many of them had their own theories about which approach would prove most successful. The Vraxian method was proven and reliable, but it required enormous physical strength that most species did not possess. The luminary technique produced incredibly strong structures, but it demanded energy manipulation abilities that were extremely rare in the galaxy. The human approach was completely unfamiliar to most observers. Tom's movements looked casual and improvised compared to the rigid procedures followed by other competitors. He seemed to be making up his strategy as he went along, adapting his plans based on what materials he found and how they could be used most effectively. To beings who valued careful planning and established procedures, his method appeared chaotic and unprofessional. But a few of the more experienced observers began to notice something interesting about the human's work. Despite his apparently random approach, everything he built served multiple purposes. A support beam that also functioned as a water collection system. A wall panel that provided both structural strength and temperature regulation. His shelter was becoming an integrated system where every component worked together rather than a collection of separate parts forced to cooperate. The timer showed that 15 minutes had elapsed since the competition began. Most teams were still in the early phases of their construction projects, gathering materials and preparing foundations. The Vraxians were ahead of their usual schedule, and Ambassador Prism's crystal garden was beginning to take recognizable shape. Tom had assembled what looked like a small pile of bent metal and curved tubes, giving no indication of what his final structure would look like when completed. At the 20-minute mark, something remarkable began to happen in Tom Bradley's construction area. What had appeared to be a random collection of bent materials suddenly started to make sense as he began connecting the various components together. The alien observers leaned forward in their seats, trying to understand the logic behind his seemingly chaotic approach to shelter building. Tom worked with the fluid confidence of someone who had done similar tasks thousands of times before. His hands moved quickly, but never seemed hurried, and every action served a clear purpose, even when that purpose was not immediately obvious to spectators. He had developed his own rhythm that was completely different from the mechanical precision of the Vraxians or the flowing meditation of the Luminari. The first major component of his shelter became visible when Tom began assembling what looked like a triangular framework. But this was not a simple triangle like those taught in basic engineering courses throughout the galaxy. Instead, it was a complex geometric shape that curved and twisted in ways that defied conventional construction. Wisdom. The joints were not rigid connections, but flexible pivots that allowed the entire structure to move and adapt to external pressures. Commander Thorne's team had completed their excavation and were beginning to install the prefabricated wall sections. For their underground bunker. Their construction site looked like a precision manufacturing facility, with each Vraxian performing their assigned tasks with mechanical efficiency. They were actually ahead of their record-setting pace from the previous year, and their confidence was growing with every completed section. Ambassador Prism's crystal garden had grown into a stunning architectural masterpiece that looked more like a work of art than a survival shelter. Delicate crystal spires twisted skyward, while broader crystal platforms provided solid foundations and wall surfaces. The entire structure glowed with soft light that came from within the crystalline matrix, creating an otherworldly beauty that drew admiring looks from observers throughout the viewing stands. But Tom's approach was capturing attention for completely different reasons. His shelter did not look like anything that had ever been built in the history of the competition. Instead of trying to create a rigid structure that would resist the planet's harsh environment, he was building something that would bend and flex with the forces around it. The framework he had constructed could actually twist and move without breaking, like a tree bending in the wind rather than snapping. The breakthrough moment came when Tom began installing what appeared to be ordinary polymer sheets as walls for his shelter. But these sheets were not flat surfaces as everyone expected. Instead, he had shaped them into complex curves that would channel airflow in specific directions. When the wind hit his shelter, instead of creating pressure that would try to knock it down, the curved surfaces would actually help stabilize the entire structure. This was aerodynamic engineering at its finest, but it was based on principles that most alien civilizations had never considered. The Vraxians solved wind problems by hiding underground where air currents could not reach them. The Luminari created crystal structures so strong that wind simply bounced off them without causing damage. But Tom was using the wind itself as a structural component, making it work for him instead of against him. The ventilation system he created was even more impressive. Rather than fighting against the planet's extreme temperature changes, his shelter would actually use those temperature differences to create natural air circulation. Hot air would be channeled through cooling chambers, while cool air was directed through warming zones, creating a perfect internal climate without requiring any external power source. Tom's water collection system was equally ingenious. The curved walls of his shelter were designed to collect moisture from the air and channel it into a storage system that could provide clean drinking water for weeks. The same surfaces that protected against wind and sand also served as a sophisticated water harvesting system that would work more efficiently during the worst weather conditions. The waste disposal system was perhaps the most creative aspect of his entire design. Instead of storing waste products until they could be removed, Tom had created a biological processing system that would break down waste materials and convert them into useful components for maintaining the shelter. It was a closed-loop system that would actually improve with use rather than degrade over time. By the 30-minute mark, the alien observers were beginning to realize they were witnessing something unprecedented in the history of the competition. Tom's shelter was not just meeting the basic requirements of the challenge, it was exceeding them in ways that nobody had thought possible. His structure would not only survive for the required 72 hours, it could probably function effectively for months or even years. The judging spheres had been conducting continuous scans of all competitors throughout the challenge, and their readings from Tom's area were causing confusion in their programming. The sensors designed to evaluate shelter strength and durability were registering numbers that seemed impossibly high for such a simple-looking structure. The monitoring systems kept running additional scans to verify that their instruments were working correctly. Commander Thorne's team was making excellent progress on their bunker system and were confident they would break their previous record. But even they had begun to notice the unusual activity in the humans' construction area. The Vraxian philosophy emphasized overwhelming force and redundant systems, so they had difficulty understanding how such a lightweight structure could possibly be effective. Ambassador Prism was deep in her crystal-growing meditation, but part of her consciousness remained aware of the competition around her. The energy patterns she sensed from Tom's shelter were unlike anything she had encountered before. His structure seemed to be working with natural forces rather than opposing them, creating harmony instead of conflict. The most remarkable aspect of Tom's construction process was how he seemed to solve multiple problems with single solutions. Every component of his shelter served at least 3 different functions, and many served 5 or 6. This level of integration required an understanding of complex systems that went far beyond simple engineering knowledge. Tom had learned these techniques during his years building structures in extreme environments on Earth and throughout the solar system. When resources were limited and failure meant death, human engineers had developed the ability to create elegant solutions that made maximum use of minimal materials. What looked like improvisation to alien observers was actually the application of centuries of accumulated knowledge about survival engineering. The timer showed 35 minutes remaining in the challenge, but Tom was already putting the finishing touches on his shelter. His structure looked complete and functional, while most other competitors were still working on basic framework assembly. The alien observers were beginning to suspect they were about to witness something that would change the competition forever. The impossible happened at exactly 10 minutes and 37 seconds into the 1-hour shelter challenge. Tom Bradley stepped back from his completed shelter, wiped his hands on his work pants, and raised his right arm high above his head to signal that he was finished. The gesture was so casual and confident that it took several seconds for the full impact to register with the alien observers. Complete silence fell across the competition field like a heavy blanket. The only sounds were the distant humming of the judging spheres and the rhythmic pounding of the Vraxian digging team, who had not yet noticed that something extraordinary had just occurred. Even the wind seemed to pause as if the planet itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what would happen next. The timer display froze at 10 minutes and 37 seconds. its bright red numbers hanging in the sky like an accusation, against everything the galactic community thought they knew about construction engineering. The previous record had been 52 minutes and 14 seconds, set by the Vraxians 3 years earlier. Tom had just completed the challenge in less than 1/5 of that time. The 3 judging spheres immediately converged on Tom's shelter like metal vultures descending on carrion. Their sensors began conducting the most thorough structural analysis. In the history of the competition, scanning every joint, every surface, every component with obsessive detail. They were programmed to be suspicious of any result that deviated significantly from established norms, and this result was so far outside normal parameters that their emergency verification protocols activated automatically. Commander Thorne was the first competitor to notice the commotion around Tom's area. The massive Vraxian straightened up from his digging and saw the human standing calmly beside what appeared to be a completed shelter. Thorne's forearms fell to his sides as his brain struggled to process what his eyes were telling him. According to every construction principle he knew, it was physically impossible to build an adequate shelter in such a short time. The Vraxian commander abandoned his own construction project and walked over to examine Tom's work more closely. His teammates followed, their own disbelief evident in their confused expressions. They had spent years perfecting their bunker construction technique, shaving seconds off their time through endless practice and refinement. The idea that someone could complete the entire challenge in 10 minutes violated everything they understood about engineering. Ambassador Prism's meditation was disrupted by the sudden shift in energy patterns across the competition field. Her crystalline form flickered as she struggled to comprehend what her senses were telling her. The human's shelter was not only complete, it was radiating stability and strength that exceeded anything she had ever encountered. The crystal structures she grew were renowned for their durability, but they took hours to reach full strength. How could any shelter achieve such stability in mere minutes? The other competitors gradually became aware that something unprecedented was happening. Hive Queen Buzz directed her workers to pause their construction and investigate the disturbance. The ethereals in their containment suits floated over to observe the human shelter from multiple angles. Even the Verdani representative abandoned its soil analysis to examine this impossible achievement. Tom's shelter looked deceptively simple from the outside. It consisted of curved metal walls that seemed to flow like water frozen in mid-motion, supported by a framework that twisted and spiraled in patterns that hurt to look at for too long. The entire structure was only about 3 meters tall and 5 meters wide, making it the smallest shelter anyone had ever submitted for judging. But size was not what mattered in this competition, and the judging spheres were discovering that appearances could be incredibly deceiving. The first comprehensive structural scan revealed that Tom's shelter could withstand wind speeds of over 400 kilometers per hour, double the challenge requirement. The framework was designed to flex and bend under pressure, distributing stress throughout the entire structure rather than concentrating it at weak points. It was like comparing a blade of grass that bends in a hurricane to a rigid tree that snaps and breaks. The temperature regulation system was even more impressive. The shelter's internal environment remained at exactly 22 degrees Celsius, regardless of external conditions, without requiring any power source or mechanical systems. The curved walls created natural convection currents that moved air through cooling and warming zones in a continuous cycle. It was environmental engineering that bordered on artistic perfection. The water collection and purification system was operating at efficiency levels that exceeded anything in the judging sphere's databases. The shelter could collect moisture from air humidity as low as 5% and purify it to drinking water standards that surpassed what most civilizations could achieve with advanced technology. The waste processing system was equally remarkable, creating a closed ecological cycle that could theoretically operate indefinitely. But perhaps the most astounding discovery was the shelter's power generation capability. Tom had somehow designed the structure to harvest energy from wind, temperature differences, and solar radiation simultaneously. The shelter was not just self-sustaining, it was actually producing excess power that could be used for additional equipment or stored for future use. It was like discovering that someone had built a perpetual motion machine that actually worked. The verification process took nearly 20 minutes to complete, longer than Tom had needed to build the entire shelter. The judging spheres ran their scans multiple times, cross-referenced their databases, and even contacted the competition archives to ensure their measurements were accurate. Every test confirmed the same impossible conclusion. The human had built a shelter that exceeded all requirements by margins that should not have been possible. Commander Thorne stood in stunned silence as he examined the elegant joints and connections that held Tom's shelter together. Each component was perfectly positioned to support multiple functions while requiring minimal materials. The engineering was so sophisticated that it took the Vraxian several minutes to understand how each piece contributed to the overall structure. It was like watching a master craftsman create a complex musical instrument, where every part was essential and nothing was wasted. Ambassador Prism had completely abandoned her own construction project to study Tom's achievement. Her crystalline perception allowed her to see energy flows and structural stresses that were invisible to other species. And what she observed defied her understanding of physics. The human shelter was not just strong, it was actively adapting to changing conditions in real time, adjusting its configuration to maintain optimal performance as the environment around it shifted. The alien observers in the viewing stands had erupted into chaos as news of Tom's achievement spread throughout the galaxy via faster-than-light communication networks. Representatives from hundreds of civilizations were demanding detailed technical specifications and construction blueprints. Some were offering enormous sums for exclusive rights to the human construction techniques, while others were proposing immediate diplomatic alliances with Earth. Tom himself seemed completely unaware of the commotion his achievement had caused. He sat down on a nearby crate and pulled out a thermos of coffee, sipping the hot liquid while watching the other competitors continue their work. When reporters and officials tried to interview him about his revolutionary construction methods, he simply smiled and said he was waiting for the official results before making any statements. The timer in the sky continued counting down toward the 1-hour mark, but everyone on the field knew that the competition was effectively over. Tom Bradley had not just won the 1-hour shelter challenge. He had redefined what was possible in survival engineering and changed the way the galaxy thought about human capabilities forever. 3 days after Tom Bradley completed the shelter challenge in 10 minutes and 37 seconds, the reverberations were still spreading throughout the galaxy like ripples from a stone dropped in a still pond. The Galactic Survival Institute had called an emergency session to address what their official reports were calling the most significant advancement in survival engineering in over 2,000 years. The Institute's headquarters on the neutral world of Harmony Station buzzed with activity as representatives from hundreds of civilizations arrived to witness the formal presentation of Tom's achievement. The main auditorium, which normally held meetings attended by a few dozen delegates, had been expanded to accommodate over 3,000 observers. Even so, thousands more were attending virtually through holographic links from their home worlds. Director Nexus, an ancient crystalline being who had overseen the Institute for over 500 years, floated at the center of the main stage. Her crystalline form flickered with nervous energy as she prepared to announce changes that would fundamentally alter how the galaxy approached survival construction. The weight of history pressed down on her shoulders as she realized she was about to establish new standards that would influence engineering practices for centuries to come. Tom sat in the front row of the auditorium, looking remarkably calm, for someone who had just revolutionized an entire field of knowledge. He wore the same simple work clothes he had worn during the competition, having politely declined the ceremonial robes that protocol officials had tried to provide. His thermos of coffee sat on the floor beside his chair, and he occasionally took sips while listening to the various speeches and presentations. The technical analysis of Tom's shelter had required the combined efforts of engineering teams from dozens of different species. Each team had examined the structure from their own cultural and technological perspective, and each had reached the same startling conclusion. The human had achieved something that their most advanced theories said was impossible. The Vraxian. Engineering Corps had spent 3 full days trying to understand how Tom's flexible framework could be stronger than their rigid bunker systems. Their analysis revealed that the human approach distributed stress so efficiently that the entire structure became stronger under pressure rather than weaker. It was like discovering that a chain made of flexible links could be stronger than a solid metal bar. The Luminari had focused their analysis on the energy flows within Tom's shelter. Their natural ability to perceive and manipulate energy patterns made them the galaxy's experts on power systems and thermal dynamics. What they found challenged everything they thought they knew about energy conservation. Tom's shelter was actually generating more power than it consumed, creating what appeared to be a violation of fundamental physical laws. The ethereal scientists had examined the aerodynamic properties of Tom's curved wall systems. As gaseous beings, they understood airflow and pressure dynamics better than any solid species. Their calculations showed that Tom's shelter would actually become more stable during severe weather events, using the storm's own energy to reinforce its structural integrity. It was weather engineering that bordered on miraculous. Director Nexus began the formal presentation by displaying holographic images of Tom's shelter from every possible angle. The 3-dimensional projections allowed the audience to examine the intricate details of its construction, from the spiral support framework to the curved collection panels that harvested water and energy simultaneously. Even experienced engineers gasped as they began to understand the elegant complexity of what Tom had created. The official measurements were announced with the solemnity usually reserved for historical proclamations. Tom's shelter could withstand wind speeds up to 430 kilometers per hour. It maintained perfect internal temperature control in external conditions ranging from -50 to +80 degrees Celsius. The life support systems could sustain a single person for over 6 months, 25 times longer than the competition requirement. But the most stunning revelation was the shelter's scalability. The same design principles could be applied to structures of any size, from individual survival shelters to entire cities. The engineering teams had run computer simulations showing that Tom's techniques could be used to build space stations, planetary colonies, and even habitats for deep space exploration. The implications were staggering. The immediate impact on the competition itself was announced with appropriate ceremony. The 1-hour shelter challenge would be permanently renamed the 10-minute human standard in honor of Tom's achievement. The time limit would be reduced from 60 minutes to 15 minutes, with additional categories created for different skill levels. Most significantly, all future shelters would be judged using efficiency ratings that Tom's design had established as the new baseline. Commander Thorne took the stage to formally concede defeat on behalf of all Vraxian competitors. His species had dominated strength-based construction for over a century, but he acknowledged that they had been focusing on the wrong metrics. Raw power and redundant systems were less important than elegant design and efficient resource utilization. The Vraxian engineering academies were already restructuring their curricula to incorporate human construction philosophy. Ambassador Prism floated to the podium to announce that the Luminari Collective was requesting formal educational exchanges with Earth's engineering institutions. Her people were master of energy manipulation, but they had never considered using environmental forces as structural components. The combination of luminary energy control with human adaptive design could produce construction techniques that surpassed anything either species could achieve alone. The ethereal delegation announced their intention to establish joint research facilities with human engineers to study atmospheric dynamics in construction. The Hive Queens declared that their workers would begin learning human improvisation techniques to supplement their natural coordination abilities. Even the plant-based Verdani expressed interest in incorporating biological adaptation concepts into their growing structures. But perhaps the most significant announcement came from the Galactic Engineering Council, the organization responsible for establishing construction standards throughout known space. They were implementing immediate changes to building codes and safety regulations based on Tom's innovations. Structures built using human adaptive principles would receive priority approval and reduced inspection requirements due to their demonstrated superior performance. The economic implications were enormous. Worlds that had been considered too harsh for colonization could now be settled using Tom's construction techniques. Space stations could be built more efficiently and with greater safety margins. Disaster relief efforts could deploy shelters that would last for years rather than weeks. The entire infrastructure of galactic civilization was about to become more robust and sustainable. Tom was finally called to the stage to receive the Golden Sphere, the highest honor the Galactic Survival Institute could bestow. As he walked to the podium, the entire auditorium rose in respectful silence. Representatives of species that had never shown deference to humans stood and applauded a single individual who had advanced their understanding of engineering by centuries. In the span of 10 minutes, when asked to give a speech about his achievement, Tom simply smiled and spoke into the microphone with the same casual confidence he had shown throughout the competition. Back on Earth, we have a saying: necessity is the mother of invention. When you don't have enough materials, enough time, or enough resources, you learn to make the most of what you've got. We call it making do, but I guess you folks might call it engineering. He paused to take a sip from his thermos and continued. The thing is, every problem contains its own solution if you know how to look for it. The wind that tries to knock down your shelter can also power your lights. The temperature changes that threaten to freeze or cook, you can also move your air and clean your water. You just have to stop fighting the environment and start working with it instead. The audience listened in complete silence as Tom explained his philosophy in terms so simple that even children could understand them. He was not describing advanced scientific theories or complex mathematical principles. He was talking about common sense and practical experience, the kind of knowledge that humans had developed over thousands of years of surviving in hostile environments. As Tom concluded his brief remarks and returned to his seat, the galaxy began to understand that they had just witnessed something more profound than a record-breaking performance in an engineering competition. They had been introduced to a completely different way of thinking about problems and solutions, a philosophy that would influence their civilizations for generations to come. The age of human innovation had officially begun, and the universe would never be the same.